Hi, you're watching theAnalysis-news, and I'm Talia Baroncelli. Today I'll be joined by Palestinian-American journalist Rami Khouri. We'll be discussing the Gaza ceasefire deal. If you've been enjoying our content, you can go to our website, theanalysis.news, and make a donation if you can by hitting the donate button at the top right corner of the screen. Most importantly, get onto our mailing list to get all of our content sent straight to your inbox. You can also like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Make sure you hit the bell to get all of our notifications and listen to us on podcast streaming services such as Spotify or Apple. All right, let's get into it with Rami Khouri. Joining me now is Rami Khouri. He's a Palestinian-American journalist who's been covering issues in the Middle East for over 55 years. He is also an Al Jazeera op-ed columnist and a distinguished public policy fellow at the American University of Beirut. So, Rami, it's great to have you today. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be with you.
So, Israel and Hamas have agreed to a ceasefire deal, and phase one is currently being implemented. And this is the same agreement that was proposed by U.S. President Joe Biden all the way back on May 31st of last year. And we've seen numerous Israeli commentators who are either anti or pro Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu say that Netanyahu was the primary obstacle to the deal, that he was the one who was stalling and that he didn't want a formal ceasefire deal to come about. So what do you make of President Trump's Mideast envoy, Steve Witkoff, going to Israel and essentially pressuring Netanyahu to push the deal over the finish line?
Yeah, there's a lot of factors that are at play here, but I would say the main ones are that it's not just Netanyahu who didn't really want a ceasefire. It's the Zionist movement, the Zionist extremists, who for the last 100 years have been trying to throw the Palestinians out of Palestine or just get them to stay there as housemaids and servants under Jewish domination. So the Zionism has had this streak of military conquest, and particularly against Palestinians, spreading also now to Syria and to Lebanon and other places. But Netanyahu was the main driving force for continuing the war because it helped protect his political incumbency. But Zionism is the real problem, because Zionism has never been defined just saying a state for the Jewish people. The criminal colonial British supported this, made it happen, and then passed the torch of colonial criminality to the United States after World War II, which has supported Israel and Zionism in doing whatever they want to do in the Middle East. And we've seen it now in the last year and a half. Israel running wild across the whole region with its very sophisticated military capabilities, which are almost entirely dependent on the U.S., and attacking any country that it wants to attack, assassinating anybody it wants to assassinate. So Netanyahu wanted to keep this going, hoping it would push the Palestinians out of Gaza eventually. But it never happened, because one of the things that Zionism has never learned is that an indigenous people that is threatened and subjugated by foreign colonial occupiers will fight back to the last man and woman. The Israelis did this in Masada, and they did it in other places historically, in Europe and other places when they were subjugated. They fought back. They didn't surrender and lie down and play dead. And the Palestinians are doing the same thing. They will resist as much as they can. And, when the conflict started in the early part of last century, there was, about 1 million people in Palestine. And by 1948, when the State of Israel was created, there was 1.5 million Palestinians. That's all there was. Today, there's about 14 million Palestinians. And every single one of them is committed to achieving their rights, which means a Palestinian state alongside the State of Israel, not destroying Israel as Zionist propaganda has it, but a Palestinian state with its full sovereign rights, peacefully living with Israel, and expecting Israel to do the same, live peacefully with Palestinians. But Zionism and the State of Israel, and it seems the United States, do not want to have a Palestinian state come into being. So this was really one of the main reasons why this went on. The reason that finally the Israelis accepted the ceasefire, I believe, is partly the arm twisting by by Trump, but also the fact they realized that they had nothing more to gain with more military action. They weren't going to destroy Hamas. They were not going to evict the Palestinians from Gaza. They were not going to get the Palestinians to surrender. And therefore, all they were doing is digging themselves further into a big hole in front of global public opinion and the global legal system. So when the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice and other courts around the world took positions criticizing what Israel was doing as a plausible genocide, what the Israelis did is they tried to shred international law like they shredded babies in their sleep with their advanced weaponry, just destroy international law. And the American government and its colonial criminality went along with this. So this is the real problem, too. I think the bigger picture we need to keep in mind. This is not just a Gaza or Hamas, Israel, or Netanyahu and Hamas conflict. This is the last anti-colonial struggle in the entire world. And that's why the entire world, essentially, the global south and much of the global north, has supported Palestinian rights for peaceful coexistence and criticized Israel. And that's why the Israelis are going crazy, because they can't handle being checked or being contained either by Arab resistance or by international pressures. They expect to be able to do anything they want, which is what they've been able to do over the last 70, 80, 100 years because of massive Western support. But this is all changing now, and this is the situation we're in. The ceasefire hopefully will allow everybody to rethink this and move to the next phase where we might stop the current fighting and war and then move towards a permanent negotiation for a permanent resolution of the conflict. That's a big sticker item, but it can be done. We'll just leave that for the next round. But right now it's to consolidate the ceasefire and come to terms with what happened and hold people accountable on both sides.
Well, we will get to the specifics of the 3 stages of the ceasefire deal, but first I wanted to ask you, and you've already alluded to this, what you think of the Blinken and Biden administration and how they've essentially aided and abetted a genocide using U.S. taxpayer funds and U.S. weapons. And Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, recently said that Hamas is now able to actually replenish its ranks. So based on what he's saying, it does sound like all of the destruction and the genocide was really for nothing. What do you think of that?
I think the American administration, personified by Blinken and Biden and Kamala Harris, are at the same time heartless and incompetent. It's an incredible combination to have when you're running the most powerful military machine and government in the world, to be heartless and incompetent. They were simply doing whatever the Israeli government wanted them to do, and their Zionist, pro-Zionist, pro-Israeli donors in the United States. It was a disgraceful performance, and it really was the pit of American modern politics. American politics had degraded into the mud. And we saw it so clearly in the Gaza situation. And they tried to cover it up with all kinds of fancy public relations, and none of it worked. The majority of American people wanted a ceasefire. A small majority wanted to have constraints on American arms sales to Israel. Most young American Jews were for a ceasefire and were critical of what the Israeli and American governments were doing. So the trend in public opinion in the United States and across most of the Western world, with only a few exceptions, was against what Israel was doing because it was a criminal, savage assault, inhuman, indecent, indiscriminate, endless savagery, attacking sleeping mothers and children in their tents and setting them afire, or shredding them with these new weapons that send out blades and shred people like a meat grinder. And they did this over and over and over again. And the United States provided the weapons and the money and the diplomatic protection. It was one of the most disgraceful experiences of power exercised by any sovereign big power in the world. But it was completely in line with the colonial and imperial legacy. This is the important point that I think people will start to realize when they fully analyze what's going on. The major human rights institutions of the world have studied this and said this is genocidal. This is apartheid, what Israel is doing. There's massive support and proof for that position among Jewish and Israeli and American and independent, respected legal minds. But the Israelis ignore all of this because they're saying we are above the law. We do whatever we want. And this is the epitome of apartheid and a racist attitude. And therefore, what we've seen from the Americans and some European countries, especially Great Britain and Germany, has been disgraceful. I mean, these nationals of these countries should be ashamed of what their government is doing, but they can't do anything about it because the Western capitalist pseudo-democratic systems allow this to happen. They were there from the beginning when the British said in 1917 that they would support the creation of a Jewish home in Palestine, which was 93% Arab, including my family in Nazareth. And it started with the British criminal duplicity, and it continues. So it's what happened, as terrible as it was not unusual or unprecedented. The British and the French, from the late 1800s until today, have been killing Arabs in big numbers all over the region, either directly or indirectly. And then other people got into the process. Other powers got involved, the Russians, the Iranians, the Turks, even some Arab countries, the UAE and Saudi Arabia and some other Arab countries got involved in battles around the Middle East where, big numbers of people like Sudan and such, where large numbers of people were being killed or displaced. So this problem is really one of two combined problems. One is the legacy of Western imperial colonial savagery and barbarism, really, and now genocide. Combined with that is the fact that in the Arab countries that were essentially born in their current form after World War I, sovereignty has not taken hold. We don't have any sovereign Arab countries that can make their own sovereign decisions. Any Arab country that makes a big decision on arms sales, on water supplies, on industrial policy, on trade issues, big issues like that, they need the approval of some other power. It used to be in the old days just the French and then the British were the big colonial powers. But today, various Arab countries, when they make these decisions, they've got to get the approval of the U.S., of Britain, maybe France, maybe Russia, maybe Turkey, maybe Iran, maybe Saudi Arabia. So there are many Arab countries that are involved in what I call the de-sovereignization of the contemporary Arab world. So these are independent but not sovereign states, and they're not administered and run for the well-being of their own people. And that's why you have, according to credible statistics, something around 65%, 2/3 of Arab people are not able to meet their monthly essential needs bills: medicine, food, shelter, heat, water, education. 2/3 of the Arabs are poor. The Arabs have become a nation of paupers. The Arab nation as a whole, the Arab people, are a pauperized, helpless people with no political power, no ability to hold accountable their own leaders, no ability to contribute to policymaking, and no ability to resist the foreign hegemonic, predatory, savage assaults against them. And that's why when Hamas and the Palestinians have stood up to Israel, it generated such immense international support all over the world, because people like to see somebody in the South stand up to the colonial North, and Israel and the U.S. together represented the colonial North in this episode.
I do want to ask you about this concept of de-sovereignty or de-sovereignizing. I mean, you're applying it to the Arab world, but couldn't you extend that analysis to most countries in the world, given that there are such huge divides between working people and a capitalist elite, which ultimately benefits from most global economic interactions and deals. So, are you saying that this is something specific to the region, or can we kind of expand the analysis to the global level?
I honestly couldn't say. I'm not a scholar of global sovereignty. I am a scholar of Arab desovereignization, and I live it. I see it. I've experienced it. Um, and that's why you have this massive out migration of the most talented and smartest and brightest, most entrepreneurial and inventive and creative young Arab men and women for the last 50 years. They've been leaving this region and going to Europe and Australia and North America because they can't live here as full human beings. So it might be true for many countries around the world that are dependent on powerful other big countries that support them. Um, and maybe it's the nature of global capitalism. I'm not a scholar of these things, but for the Arab region, this is very clear. And part of the problem is the capitalist runaway system. But again, I'm not a scholar of that, so I couldn't talk about that with any credibility. But you see clearly that the powers, and I mean, there is some evidence in the record, if you read Noam Chomsky's books and others, where there's a lot of record quotations and documentation of Western powers, the US, Great Britain, and others, who said outright, we need to go into this country because we need to control their oil. We need to benefit from their energy. The idea that smaller countries, independent countries in the South have sovereign rights and the ability to control their own resources and make their own decisions, that's not fully accepted by major Western powers. And we see this exercised more openly and more viciously than ever before in the continuing Israeli genocide, because the Israelis are now there's a ceasefire in Gaza, which hopefully will hold, but now the Israelis have open season in the West Bank. They're burning villages and attacking people, and we'll see what happens if anybody steps in or not.
Right. And what you're speaking about is essentially what the Biden administration and what Secretary Blinken constantly refer to as the so-called rules-based order, which is essentially a weaponization of the actual liberal international order, which was formed after World War II, and using that as a discursive tool to implement all sorts of imperialist exploitation on people in the global South and other parts of the world. And as you mentioned, people in the US, many voters actually were really opposed to the war in Gaza, to the genocide in Gaza. And there was actually a YouGov poll conducted by the Institute for Middle East Understanding, which showed that the onslaught and bombardment of Gaza was a huge issue for voters who decided to actually sit out the election and not to vote. I think it was 29% of people who were polled said that that was one of the main reasons why they decided not to vote. So based on those facts and that there is, general disapproval with these wars, do you think Trump is actually picking up on this sentiment, or has he put pressure on Netanyahu to push forward a ceasefire deal for his own personal reasons, or just not have additional conflict in the Middle East? Or is this also part of his normalization that he's trying to bring about between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and to ensure that the Abraham Accords are fully implemented?
It's probably a combination of all those things. But before I talk more back to your question, what Blinken calls a rules-based order, it's not a rules-based. Take out the L. It's a ruse. It's a trick. It's a deception. When these rules were made after World War II, they were supposed to protect the world from human rights abuses and gross genocidal atrocities as the Nazis did. That was the purpose. But it was only applied to weaker miscreants and tyrants and criminals in the global South. So in Africa and mostly, and one or two in the former Yugoslavia. When people challenged the Western hegemonic powers, they were subjected to this rules-based order. But the rules are not really rules. It's a ruse. It's a trick. And this is how the Western world the imperial world has always acted talking nicely, but acting viciously. So Trump's motivation is really one of the great new puzzles of our region and the world. And anywhere that you look in the world, Ukraine, China, wherever, Russia, people are speculating all the time. So I don't want to add to the speculation. I prefer to, keep my journalistic tradition as one of reporting facts as far as I can define them, identify them. What we do know is that he has appointed a lot of people in Middle East posts that are almost totally committed to the Zionist project, though he has appointed a few people in the Defense Department, some undersecretaries and assistant secretaries of state, who are against American military action in the Middle East, against supporting Israeli wars against Iran and things like that. So he's made some appointments that are a little bit contradictory, and he may not realize that. I mean, we have no idea how these appointments are made, who makes them. So we'll just have to wait and see. What we do know is that Trump is an egomaniac. He wants the world to thank him for saving the world. He believes that he is a savior, now including, divinely ordained interventions to save his life. And he wants to make history. And we shouldn't rule out the possibility that he might actually realize that the trajectory the U.S. is on now and has been for many decades is terribly destructive. If you look at the spread of American bases, I don't know how many now, there's like 40 bases, military bases all over the region, and others just over the
I
horizon.
think there are like over 800 across the globe, something like that.
Yeah, but it's incredible. And the consequence of this is that what had been a little limited conflict in Palestine in the 1920s and 30s and 40s under the British between the Zionist colonizers and the indigenous Palestinians, then slowly spread, and then after 48 Israel was created, and then you had Arab countries fighting against Israel, and Israel beat most of them because of the massive support it had from the West and its own motivation, and therefore conflict grew to Arab-Israeli, and then the Iranians got involved. And if you look at the last year and a half, you had Israel and the U.S. and Great Britain at one point fighting 6 or 7 different people militarily, including in Yemen and Iraq, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine. Unbelievable. Leave apart for the moment the massive public opinion position across the entire Arab region, which is heavily critical of Israel and the United States, but also committed to peaceful coexistence with an Israeli state that accepts a Palestinian state and accepts to negotiate a peaceful permanent agreement, which Hamas has proposed many times, by the way. At least 10 times Hamas leaders have publicly and privately, in letters to the U.S. president, to the Israeli prime minister, to others in public statements there. Even Hamas has, and they repeated it yesterday. A Hamas official said, we are open to discussions with the United States, as Iran is. So the real problem here is with Trump is that, first of all, we don't know what he wants. He's not an ideological person. He's a theatrical person. He likes applause. He likes drama. He likes to be the center of attention, and he likes the accolades. And we should call his bluff and say, look, great, savior of the world, we're with you. And here's how you save the world. And you should get 7 Nobel Prizes, not just 1. And you do that by reigning in Zionism, pushing the Israelis and the Palestinians to a negotiated resolution, as happened now with the ceasefire. Get the other great powers involved to help cement a permanent peace. That would resolve if you resolve the Palestine-Israel conflict, the Arab-Israeli conflicts would be resolved. Then the Iranian-Israel conflict would disappear because Israel would no longer threaten Iran. And normalization with the Saudis and everybody else would be perfectly reasonable. Everybody should normalize with everybody else across the region and with Turkey and with Iran. Imagine if you had the Israelis and the Palestinians and the Jordanians and the Syrians, Iranians, Saudis all working together. This place would be the greatest global economic engine for the next 50 years. with the energy and the resources and the human power that's there. So the main constraint to this in the last 100 years has been the combination of predatory militaristic Zionism that's unchecked and Western colonial imperial support for that militarism, leading to a situation of Arab countries that are run as dictatorships in most cases, and declining living conditions across most of the region, except for the small wealthy oil states, and therefore building up greater tensions and tensions and tensions. And the consequence of this has been what we've seen, which is resistance. When people are oppressed, they resist. Some of them flee, some of them emigrate, and you can't blame them. But resistance is the human response to subjugation, and the people who most valiantly, perhaps, and visibly portrayed this throughout history were the Jewish people, in many cases, in antiquity and in modern times. So if Trump realizes this, that this legacy has only, and will continue to only create more conflict, more tension, and a much more powerful will to resist, he might then say, look, how do we stop this? We got to stop this by solving the core problems. And the fact that in the last 20 years, you saw the rise of this axis of resistance, which has been weakened now by the Israeli-American attacks, but the Hezbollah, Hamas, Ansarullah in Yemen, the Iranians and others in Iraq and Syria, these people emerged because of the natural instinct to resist oppression and subjugation and predatory colonial interventions in our regions, and therefore we need to keep reminding the Western leaders that there is a way to live peacefully in this region amongst ourselves, with Israelis, with Iranians, with Turks, with Arabs. Everybody can live peacefully. They have in the past and in many cases. And this is something that the Western powers have never really learned or absorbed. And maybe they're incapable of accepting that. But I don't think so. I think if you look at the white South Africans, how they came to terms with, the colonial apartheid that they had implemented, and they realized it was not sustainable. And to their credit, they, F.W. de Klerk and his pals said, look, this is going to just kill us and kill a lot of Black South Africans. So
Sorry, if I could
people can't.
interrupt, I think it's also worth noting that there have been numerous attempts by Palestinians to resist peacefully. I mean, there was the Great March of Return, and oftentimes that's not, centered in a lot of these discussions, and it's ignored. And so, there are discussions around whether violence is justified or not. That's a whole other discussion, and we can also, debate whether violence against civilians is ever justified. I personally don't believe so, but I'm not in a position to judge people. But I just want to underline that there have been all sorts of acts of peaceful form of resistance. And in those moments, Israelis were actually shooting at these peaceful protesters, especially in the case of the Great March of Return, for example.
Right. So the Israelis, or the Zionists, I should be careful, because not all Israelis are cruel, savage killers. I know I have Israeli friends and some great people, and I know that. And not all Americans are colonial butchers either.
And that was part one of my conversation with Rami Khouri. In part two, we'll be speaking a bit more about the prospects for peace and equality in the region. Thanks for watching.